They thought buying a crumbling farmhouse for almost nothing meant they'd live out their final years in peace. But what this abandoned elderly couple found buried beneath their property wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was $260 million in hidden treasure and a truth that would force their children to face exactly who they'd become. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The Montana wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow as it swept across the 80 acres of forgotten land that surrounded the old Marshall farmhouse. The structure stood weathered and worn at the end of a gravel road that hadn't been maintained in over a decade, its white paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, revealing grey wood underneath that had seen 70 years of seasons. This was home to Margaret and Henry Marshall, though most days it felt less like a home and more like a place to wait for the end. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, her 72-year-old hands submerged in lukewarm water, washing the same 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 coffee mugs they used every single day. Through the window above the sink, she could see Henry shuffling across the yard toward his woodshop, a converted tool shed where he spent most afternoons now. His gait was slower than it used to be, favoring his left leg where the knee had given out 3 winters back. They couldn't afford the surgery. Hell, they could barely afford the heating oil. The house groaned around her in that particular way old houses do, settling into itself like an elderly person lowering into a chair. The kitchen was small, outdated, with laminate countertops installed sometime in the 1970s that had cracked and yellowed with age. The linoleum floor was worn through in patches near the stove, but it was clean. Margaret kept it clean. Dignity didn't cost anything, her mother used to say. She dried the dishes slowly, methodically, and placed them back in the cabinet. 2 of everything. It had been 2 of everything for the past 6 years, ever since the children stopped coming around. Well, not stopped exactly. That made it sound sudden, like a door slamming shut. It was more gradual than that, more cruel in its slowness. Fewer visits, shorter phone calls, excuses that became patterns that became silence. Sarah, their oldest at 48, lived in Seattle now. She was a corporate attorney, married to another corporate attorney, living in a house with more bathrooms than Margaret had rooms. She'd visited last Christmas, stayed for exactly 4 hours, spent most of that time on her phone, and left behind a stack of brochures for assisted living facilities. "Just something to think about," she'd said, kissing Margaret's cheek with lips that never quite smiled anymore. "You and Dad are getting older. These places have nurses, activities, people your own age." What Sarah didn't say, but Margaret heard anyway, was that they were becoming an inconvenience, a liability, something to be managed and filed away. Michael, their middle child at 45, was no better. He worked in finance in Denver, talked constantly about his portfolio and his investments and his vacation home in Aspen. He called maybe twice a year, always rushing, always distracted. "Just checking in, Mum. Things are crazy here. I'll try to visit soon." Soon never came. Last time Margaret had seen him was 3 years ago at his daughter's graduation. He'd hugged her stiffly, commented on how much weight Henry had lost, and then spent the rest of the event networking. Daniel, the youngest at 42, had been the gentlest of the 3. He lived in Billings, worked as a teacher, had a wife and 2 kids Margaret barely knew. He used to visit more often, used to bring the grandchildren out to run through the fields and collect rocks and feed the chickens back when they still had chickens. But even Daniel had drifted. His wife didn't like the drive. The kids had activities. Life got busy. The visits stopped. The calls became texts. The texts became silence. Margaret set the last plate in the cabinet and closed the door softly. She looked at the calendar hanging on the wall, one of those free ones from the feed store with pictures of tractors. Today was November 18th. Her birthday had been 3 weeks ago, 72 years old. None of the children had called. She walked to the living room where an old space heater hummed in the corner, struggling against the cold that seeped through the single-pane windows. The furniture was older than her marriage, older than her children. A floral couch with wooden arms worn smooth by decades of hands, 2 recliners that didn't recline anymore, a coffee table covered in unpaid bills she'd been staring at for weeks. The property tax notice sat on top, $4,732, due in 30 days. They didn't have it. They didn't have half of it. Beneath that was the notice from the electric company. Past due. Beneath that, the fuel oil bill. Beneath that, Henry's prescription refills that they'd been stretching, cutting pills in half, skipping doses. Margaret sank into her recliner and closed her eyes. When had everything become so hard? When had simply existing become an act of endurance? The front door opened and Henry shuffled in, bringing the cold with him. He was 75, tall and lean in the way of men who'd worked physical jobs their whole lives and then stopped eating much when work ended. His face was weathered, lined deep around the eyes and mouth. His hair, what was left of it, was the color of old snow. "Getting colder," he said, peeling off his jacket. "Might snow tonight." Margaret opened her eyes. "Furnace is making that sound again." Henry paused, jacket halfway off. They both knew what that sound meant. The furnace was old, installed in 1986 when they'd first bought this place from Henry's father. It had been limping along for the past 5 years, held together by Henry's mechanical knowledge and sheer stubbornness. But even stubbornness had limits. "I'll look at it," he said quietly. "Henry." Her voice carried the weight of all the things they didn't say. "We can't afford another repair." He hung his jacket on the hook by the door and stood there staring at it. "I know. We have to choose, heat or your medication. I'll skip a few doses. I'll be fine." "You won't be fine. Your blood pressure." "Margaret." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the same exhaustion she felt. "What do you want me to do? We don't have the money. We don't have anything." She wanted to argue. But what was the point? He was right. They had 80 acres of land they couldn't sell because nobody wanted property this remote, this raw. They had a house falling apart around them. They had Social Security checks that disappeared into bills before they could even cash them. They had 3 children who'd moved on to bigger, better things. "Maybe we should call Sarah," Margaret said softly. "Ask if—" "No," Henry's voice was firm. "We're not begging our own children for help. We raised them, fed them, put them through school. If they cared, they'd be here." Margaret looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring she'd worn for 52 years. The gold was thin now, worn down by time. They used to care. Henry crossed the room and lowered himself into his recliner with a grunt. "People change. Priorities change. We're just not theirs anymore." They sat in silence as the afternoon faded into evening, as the space heater hummed and the old house settled and the temperature dropped. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, drifting past the windows like ghosts. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The cold had worked its way into the bedroom despite the extra blankets, despite the draft blockers she'd shoved under the door. Beside her, Henry snored softly. His breathing labored in that way that always worried her. She lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, and thought about everything they'd lost. Not just money or comfort or warmth, but purpose, place, the feeling of being needed, of mattering to someone. When sleep finally wouldn't come, she slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in an old robe, and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. She hadn't been up here in months, maybe longer. The attic was crammed with decades of accumulated life, boxes of Christmas ornaments they no longer bothered to unpack, old toys the grandchildren had outgrown, furniture too broken to use but too precious to throw away. And somewhere up here, she remembered, were things they might be able to sell. Old tools, maybe, vintage clothing, anything to scrape together a few dollars. She clicked on the bare bulb that hung from the ceiling and began sorting through boxes. Most of it was junk, worthless even to nostalgia. But in the back corner, behind a stack of Henry's old work clothes, she found a wooden crate she didn't recognize. It was heavy, sealed with rusty nails. She pried it open carefully, the old wood groaning in protest. Inside were papers, folders, documents yellow with age. She lifted them out carefully, spreading them across the dusty floor. Property deeds, survey maps, letters in handwriting she recognized as Henry's father's. Thomas Marshall had been a careful man, meticulous. He'd kept records of everything. Margaret squinted at the documents in the dim light. Most of it was standard. Property boundaries, water rights, timber assessments from the 1950s. But one map caught her attention. It was different from the others, more detailed, hand-drawn. At the top, in Thomas's precise script, Marshall Property Comprehensive Survey, 1957. She traced the lines with her finger. There was the house, the barn that had collapsed in 98, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. But there, in the northwest section near the old oak grove they never ventured into anymore, was something marked in red ink, a small square. Beside it, 3 words, Root Cellar Complex. Margaret frowned. They didn't have a root cellar, not one she knew about anyway. She'd lived on this property for 43 years. Surely she would have known. She dug deeper into the crate and found another document, this one typed on official-looking letterhead from something called the Regional Preservation Society, dated March 1958. It was addressed to Thomas Marshall and referenced custodial duties and maintenance of Preservation Vault as discussed. The letter confirmed receipt of payment, $200 for annual oversight services. Preservation Vault, not root cellar, vault. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She found more papers, receipts for concrete work, for steel doors, for climate control equipment, all dated between 1956 and 1958, all paid for by Thomas Marshall, all related to something on this property that she had never seen. At the bottom of the crate was a small leather journal. She opened it carefully. Thomas's handwriting filled the pages, entries dated from January 1956 to October 1958. The final entry made her breath catch. The vault is sealed and secure. Contents logged and preserved as requested. Coordinates 47 degrees 12 minutes north, 113 degrees 46 minutes west. Depth 22 feet. May God keep what we have protected. May the right hands find it when the time comes. T.M. Margaret sat back, her mind racing. Thomas had died in November of 1958, suddenly, a heart attack while working in the field. Henry had been only 17. There'd been no time for last conversations, no passing down of secrets. Whatever Thomas had built or protected or hidden, the knowledge had died with him. Until now. She looked at the coordinates again, then at the map. The oak grove, northwest section. Land they never used because it was too overgrown, too rocky, too remote. Land that had been sitting there for 67 years, undisturbed. Margaret carefully gathered all the documents and carried them downstairs. Dawn was just breaking, painting the kitchen in shades of grey. She spread everything across the table and made coffee, her hands trembling slightly. When Henry shuffled in 20 minutes later, she was still staring at the papers. "What's all this?" he asked, pouring himself a cup. "I found it in the attic, your father's papers." Henry sat down, pulling the map toward him. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, scanned the details. "Where'd this come from?" "Wooden crate in the back. Henry, look here." She pointed to the red square. "Root Cellar Complex, Preservation Vault. Your father built something on this property." Henry picked up the journal, read the final entry. His face, already pale, went paler. "This doesn't make sense. Dad never said anything about a vault." "He died before he could, but look at the receipts. Thousands of dollars spent. Steel doors, climate control. This wasn't just a place to store potatoes." "It's probably collapsed by now. 67 years underground, moisture, shifting soil. Or it's still there. Margaret's voice carried an edge of something Henry hadn't heard in years. Excitement. Those coordinates, we could find it. See if there's anything left. Henry set down the journal and looked at his wife, really looked at her. Saw the hope flickering in her eyes, fragile as candlelight. Margaret, even if we find it, it's probably empty, or full of rot, or dangerous. Or it's exactly what your father said, preserved, protected, waiting for the right hands. She reached across the table and took his weathered hand in hers. We have nothing to lose, Henry. Nothing. We're sitting here in a freezing house, rationing your medication, wondering if our own children even remember we exist, if there's even a chance. A chance of what? Treasure? Henry's laugh was bitter. This isn't a movie, Margaret. No, it's not. It's our life. And maybe, just maybe, your father left us something. A reason, a purpose, something. Her grip tightened. I need to know. I need to see. Don't you? Henry was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow had stopped and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds. He looked at the map again, at his father's careful handwriting, at the coordinates that pointed to a section of their own property they'd ignored for decades. My knees are shot, he said finally, and you can barely grip a jar lid with your arthritis. I know. It's probably a wild goose chase. Probably. We'll look like fools. Margaret smiled, sad and hopeful at once. We already do, Henry. We're two old people nobody wants, living in a house nobody comes to. At least this way, we're fools with a purpose. He stared at her, then down at the map, then back at her, and something in him, something that had been dormant for years, stirred. Curiosity, determination, the feeling of having a reason to get out of bed. All right, he said. We'll look, but we do it smart. We scout it first, see what we're dealing with. Margaret's smile widened, genuine now. Thank you. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Henry found his old compass, his work gloves, a length of rope they might need. Margaret packed water, sandwiches, basic first aid supplies. They bundled up in their warmest coats, pulled on their boots, and stepped out into the cold November morning. The walk to the northwest section took longer than it should have. They had to stop twice for Henry's knee, once for Margaret to catch her breath. The land here was wild, untouched, thick with brambles and fallen branches. The oak grove loomed ahead, ancient trees with trunks wider than their car, branches bare and reaching toward the grey sky like desperate hands. Coordinates say it should be just past those two oaks, Henry said, checking the compass against the map. They pushed through the undergrowth, thorns catching on their coats, and then Margaret stopped. Henry, look. Ahead of them, the ground dipped unnaturally. Not a gradual slope, but a deliberate depression, maybe 20 feet across, covered in decades of dead leaves and wild growth. But there, barely visible beneath the vegetation, was an edge. Straight. Man-made. They approached carefully. Henry kicked away leaves and exposed concrete, weathered but solid. They followed the edge, clearing as they went, until they found it. A seam. A hatch. 3 feet square, made of metal that had rusted but not failed, sealed tight with a lock that had long since corroded into uselessness. Margaret knelt beside it, her arthritic fingers tracing the edge. It's real, she whispered. It's really here. Henry stood above her, staring down at the hatch. His father had built this. His father had sealed something here and never told a soul. We need tools, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Pry bars, bolt cutters. We're not getting this open with our bare hands. Margaret looked up at him, and in that moment they weren't 72 and 75. They weren't forgotten by their children or buried by bills or beaten down by life. They were partners in discovery, conspirators in hope. Let's go get them, she said. They walked back to the house together, moving faster now despite the pain in their joints, despite the cold. Because for the first time in 6 years, maybe longer, they had something that felt like purpose. Something buried beneath their feet, sealed away in darkness, waiting for the right hands to find it. And they had no idea that what lay below would change everything. They returned to the oak grove just after noon, this time loaded with tools that Henry had kept organized in his workshop for decades. A crowbar that had belonged to his father, bolt cutters he'd bought in the 1990s, 2 heavy-duty flashlights with fresh batteries Margaret had found at the back of a drawer, work gloves, a small sledgehammer, wire brushes to clear rust. They moved slowly, carefully. The weight of the tools, nothing compared to the weight of anticipation. The hatch was exactly where they'd left it, waiting like a question mark pressed into the earth. Henry knelt beside it with a grunt, his bad knee protesting. Margaret crouched next to him, already working at the edges with a wire brush, clearing away decades of oxidation and dirt. "Lock's completely rusted through," Henry muttered, examining the mechanism. "Might not even need the bolt cutters." He was right. When he applied pressure with the crowbar, the entire lock assembly crumbled like old bread, pieces of corroded metal falling into the leaves. But the hatch itself remained sealed, held by hinges that had fused with age and weather. "Stand back," Henry said, positioning the crowbar into the seam. He pulled. Nothing. Tried again, putting his full weight into it. Still nothing. Margaret joined him, her small hands gripping the bar below his, and together they heaved. The metal groaned, a sound like something waking from a long sleep. Rust flaked away. The seam cracked wider. "Again," Henry gasped, and they pulled together. This time the hatch gave, not smoothly, but with a shriek of protesting metal and a shower of rust that made them both step back, coughing. The hatch swung open on hinges that screamed, and a rush of air escaped from below. Not foul air, not the smell of decay they'd expected, but cool, dry air that carried a faint scent of concrete and metal. They stood at the edge and looked down. Stone steps descended into absolute darkness, each step carved from solid rock or poured concrete. They couldn't tell which. 22 feet deep, Thomas's journal had said. That was a lot of stairs, a lot of darkness. Henry clicked on his flashlight and aimed it down. The beam caught stone walls, narrow but solid, disappearing into shadow below. "You sure about this?" he asked. Margaret turned on her own flashlight. "We've come this far." Henry went first, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. Margaret followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder for balance, the other holding her light steady. The temperature dropped as they descended. The walls pressed close on either side, close enough to touch, and Margaret did touch them, running her fingers along stone that was smooth, deliberately finished. "This wasn't cheap to build," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "No," Henry agreed. "This was serious construction." 22 steps. They counted each one. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small chamber, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for Henry to stand upright. Their flashlight beams swept the space, revealing walls of reinforced concrete, a floor that was level and dry, and straight ahead, a door. Not wood, steel. Heavy-gauge steel with a wheel-lock mechanism like something from a bank vault. And along the top edge, barely visible, a small green light blinked steadily. "Is that—" Margaret's voice caught. "Is that a power indicator?" Henry stepped closer, examining the mechanism. His breath came out in short clouds despite the dry air. "That's exactly what it is. There's still power down here." "After 67 years?" "Must be on some kind of backup system. Geothermal, maybe, or a battery array that self-maintains." He shook his head in disbelief. "Your father-in-law wasn't playing around." The wheel lock turned more easily than the hatch had, as if the mechanism had been maintained somehow, protected from the elements. Henry spun it counterclockwise, feeling the bolts retract with solid, precise clicks. When the final bolt released, he pulled the door open. The space beyond swallowed their flashlight beams. Not a small room, but something vast. They stepped through together, and Margaret found a switch on the wall inside. She flipped it without thinking, and overhead lights flickered to life. Fluorescent tubes, old but still functional, buzzing to illumination one after another until the entire space was revealed. They stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The chamber was enormous, at least 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, carved out of the earth and reinforced with concrete and steel beams. But it wasn't one open space. It was divided into sections, each one carefully organized, each one holding things that made no sense, things that shouldn't exist down here in the dark beneath 80 acres of forgotten Montana land. The first section, directly ahead, contained metal filing cabinets and waterproof cases stacked neatly on industrial shelving. Henry approached them like he was approaching something holy. He opened the nearest case and found documents inside, sealed in plastic sleeves, perfectly preserved. He pulled one out carefully. It was a letter typed on yellowed paper, dated April 1944. The letterhead read, Whitmore Estate, Connecticut. The text made his hands shake. Dear Mr. Marshall, we entrust to your care the items listed in the accompanying manifest. Given the uncertainties of our current global situation, we believe preservation in your secure facility is our best option. Should anything happen to our family, these items are to be returned to our legal heirs as determined by the enclosed documentation. Payment as agreed has been transferred to your account. With gratitude and hope, Jonathan Whitmore. Margaret was reading over his shoulder. 1944. That's World War II. People were scared, Henry said, still staring at the letter. Scared of invasion, of economic collapse, of losing everything. They were hiding valuables. And your father was helping them. They moved to the next case. More letters, more documents, all from different families, different estates. The dates ranged from 1942 through 1957. Dozens of families, hundreds of items, each carefully logged, each transaction documented. Thomas Marshall hadn't just been a farmer, he'd been a custodian, a keeper of other people's treasures, paid to preserve and protect. There's more, Margaret said, moving deeper into the chamber. The second section made them both stop breathing. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked 2 and 3 high, each one labeled with careful handwriting. Dates, family names, inventory codes. Henry approached the nearest one marked Whitmore Estate, April 1944, contents. Wine collection, estimated value, $47,000. $47,000 in 1944. Henry could barely imagine what that meant today. He used the crowbar to carefully pry open the crate. Inside, nestled in straw and protective wrapping, were bottles of wine. The labels were French, Italian, some in languages he couldn't read, but even his untrained eye could see these weren't ordinary bottles. These were old, rare, the kind of things he'd seen once on a documentary about auctions where single bottles sold for thousands. Margaret had moved to another crate. This one was marked Davidson Collection, July 1946, contents, currency and bonds, value $123,000. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside were stacks of gold coins in protective sleeves, gleaming dully under the fluorescent lights. Beneath those were certificates, bearer bonds from the 1930s, each one representing value that had probably multiplied many times over. Henry, her voice was barely a whisper. Henry, this is real money, real gold. They moved faster now, opening crate after crate, each one revealing treasures that belonged in museums or locked vaults, not buried beneath a Montana farm. Paintings wrapped in protective cloth, canvases by artists whose names Margaret recognized from art history classes she'd taken 40 years ago. First edition books sealed in airtight containers, manuscripts in careful calligraphy, jewelry in velvet-lined cases, gemstones that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow fragments. At the far end of the chamber, they found a desk. Solid oak, preserved as carefully as everything else. On top sat a leather-bound ledger, thick as a dictionary. Henry opened it with trembling fingers. Every page was filled with Thomas's meticulous handwriting. Each entry logged an item: description, owner, date received, estimated value, storage location. The entries went on for pages, hundreds of items, thousands of items. At the back of the ledger, Thomas had created a summary page. Henry had to read it 3 times before his brain would accept what his eyes were seeing. Total items preserved, 1,742. Total estimated value as of December 1957, $18,300,000. But that was in 1957, 67 years ago. Henry's mind raced, trying to calculate appreciation, inflation, the increased value of rare art and vintage wine and antique jewelry. Even being conservative, even assuming half the items had degraded or lost value, they were looking at over $200 million, Margaret said, reading his thoughts. Henry, this is over $200 million. They stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by wealth beyond anything they'd ever imagined, and neither of them could speak. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere far above, wind moved through the oak trees. Down here, in this carefully constructed vault, time had stopped in 1957, and 67 years of accumulated value waited in the dark. Henry sank down onto the chair at the desk, his bad knee finally giving out. Margaret leaned against the wall, her arthritic hands pressed against the cool concrete. They stared at each other across the chamber, 2 elderly people who'd been counting pennies that morning, who'd been rationing medication and choosing between heat and food. "Is this really happening?" Margaret asked. Before Henry could answer, a sound echoed down from above, faint but unmistakable. An engine, a vehicle approaching their property. They froze. What happens next will force them to confront not just the weight of their discovery, but the danger that comes with it, the family that abandoned them, and a decision that will change their lives forever. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The sound of the engine grew louder, then stopped. A door slammed. Footsteps on gravel. Margaret and Henry looked at each other with pure panic in their eyes. Who knew they were out here? Had someone followed them, seen them coming into the oak grove with tools? Their nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Mail didn't come until afternoon. This was their land, their private property, and yet someone was up there. "Turn off the lights," Henry whispered urgently. Margaret hit the switch and the chamber plunged into darkness. They stood perfectly still, holding their breath, listening to the silence press down like a physical weight. Above them, muffled by 22 feet of earth and stone, they heard a voice calling out, "Marshall, you folks around? Got a package needs a signature." The mail carrier, just the mail carrier. Margaret let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. Henry leaned against the desk, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. They were being paranoid, seeing danger in ordinary things. But even as the relief washed over them, something else settled in its place: awareness, understanding of what they'd actually found, and what finding it meant. "We can't tell anyone," Henry said into the darkness. "Not yet. We have to tell someone eventually. We can't just—" "I know." Henry found her hand in the dark and gripped it tight. "But we need to think. We need to be smart about this. One wrong move, one wrong person, and this all goes away. Gets tied up in legal battles or stolen or claimed by someone else." Margaret squeezed his hand back. "What do? We document everything. Photographs, inventory lists, copies of all the paperwork. We figure out exactly what's here and who it legally belongs to. Then we find someone we can trust. A lawyer, maybe. Someone who can help us navigate whatever comes next." They stood in the darkness for another moment, letting the weight of it all settle. Then Henry turned his flashlight back on, and they began the slow process of securing the vault. They made sure everything was exactly as they'd found it. Every crate closed, every case sealed. Margaret took the ledger, tucking it carefully into her coat. Henry grabbed a handful of documents from the filing cabinets, enough to prove what was down here without removing anything irreplaceable. They climbed the stone stairs slowly, emerged back into afternoon light that seemed too bright, too ordinary for what they'd just seen. Together they lowered the hatch as quietly as they could, then spent 20 minutes covering it again with leaves and branches, making it look untouched. The walk back to the house felt different. The land looked the same, bare trees and brown grass and weak November sunlight, but everything had shifted. They weren't just walking across their property anymore. They were walking across something valuable, something that changed the equation of their entire lives. Inside, they spread the documents across the kitchen table and just stared at them. The ledger, the letters, the photographs of items worth more than their house, their land, everything they owned combined. Margaret made coffee with shaking hands. Henry sat in his chair and tried to process the impossible. "We should call Sarah," Margaret said finally. "She's a lawyer. She could help us figure out the legal side of this." "No." Henry's voice was flat, hard. "Henry, absolutely not. We're not calling Sarah. We're not calling any of them." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "They're our children." "Are they?" Henry looked at her, and his eyes were red-rimmed, fierce. "When's the last time Sarah called? When's the last time Michael visited? Daniel hasn't been here in over a year. They don't want to be part of our lives, Margaret. They made that clear. And now, what? We're supposed to call them up and say we found a fortune and suddenly we're worth their time again. That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Henry's voice rose, something rare for him. "They left us here to rot. They sent brochures for old folks' homes like we're problems to be warehoused. They stopped calling on our birthdays, stopped coming for Christmas, and you want to hand them this, give them a reason to suddenly care about us again." Margaret's throat tightened. "They're still our children." "Then where are they?" Henry stood up, his chair scraping hard against the floor. "Where were they when the furnace died, when we were choosing between heat and my heart medication? Where were they last month on your birthday, Margaret? Where?" She couldn't answer, because he was right. The silence from their children had been deafening, the absence louder than any words. "We're not calling them," Henry said again, quieter now. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. We do this on our own. We figure it out without them, because if we call them now with this, we'll never know if they came back because they loved us or because they loved what we found." Margaret wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "So what do we do?" Henry sat back down, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. "We document everything. Spend the next few days going through the vault, cataloguing it all, taking photographs. Then we find a lawyer, someone local, someone who doesn't know the kids, someone who can help us understand what we're sitting on and what our options are. And then we decide, together, what this means, what we want to do with it." He reached across the table and took her hand. "But we do it our way, not theirs." That night, neither of them slept. They lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the windows and the old house creak and settle, and they thought about what lay buried beneath their land. Thought about Thomas Marshall, who'd carried this secret to his grave. Thought about families who'd trusted him to preserve their treasures through uncertain times. Thought about 67 years of accumulation, of value multiplying in the darkness. "Do you think he meant for us to find it?" Margaret asked into the darkness. "I think he meant to tell my dad about it, pass it down properly. But he died too soon. Sometimes secrets die with us, even when we don't mean them to. So we found it by accident, or we found it exactly when we were supposed to." Henry turned his head to look at her profile in the dim light from the window. "Maybe it's been waiting all this time for the moment we needed it most." Margaret thought about that. About timing and desperation and the strange way life sometimes offered lifelines when you'd stopped expecting them. What if people come looking for it, Descendants of the families who stored things here, what if they want it back? Then we'll give it back. If there's legal paperwork proving ownership, if there are heirs with legitimate claims, they should have what's theirs. This isn't about stealing from anyone. But some of it might be ours, legally. Your father was paid for his services. He maintained everything, preserved it. There might be clauses about unclaimed items or time limits. Maybe. Henry stared at the ceiling. Or maybe none of it's ours. Maybe we're just the latest custodians. Maybe our job is to finally return things to the people they belong to, finish what Dad started. Even if it means staying poor. Henry was quiet for a long moment. I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and haunted. But let's not decide anything until we know what we're dealing with. For all we know, half those families are gone, dissolved, no legal heirs. For all we know, we're legally entitled to unclaimed property after 67 years. We don't know. That's why we need help. Over the next 5 days, they developed a routine. Every morning after breakfast, they walked out to the oak grove. They'd cleared a better path now, still hidden but easier to navigate. Down the stone stairs, through the steel door, into the chamber that still took their breath away every single time. Henry had brought his old camera, the digital one Michael had given them 4 Christmases ago that they'd barely used. Now he photographed everything. Every crate, every label, every item they carefully removed and examined. Margaret kept detailed notes in a spiral notebook, logging what Henry photographed, cross-referencing it with Thomas's ledger. The wine collection alone, they estimated, was worth at least $200,000, possibly more. Some of the bottles were from vineyards that no longer existed, rare vintages from the 1920s and 30s that collectors would fight over. The gold coins, depending on market value, could be worth $500,000 or more. The bearer bonds were harder to assess, but some still had active redemption value. Others were historical curiosities that collectors might pay premiums for. The paintings were where things got truly staggering. 3 canvases by artists Margaret recognized from museum visits, not household names, but known names. Artists whose work now sold for millions. Even conservative estimates put the art collection at over $10 million. Books, manuscripts, jewelry, antique furniture, silver tea sets, rare documents, historical artifacts. Thomas Marshall's ledger had listed $18 million in 1957. With appreciation, with the increased value of rare collectibles, with inflation, the actual worth was somewhere between $260 and $300 million. The number was so large it stopped meaning anything. It became abstract, fictional, impossible. They found Thomas's letter on the 5th day, tucked into the back of the ledger in a sealed envelope. Margaret opened it carefully, and they read together by flashlight, sitting side by side at the oak desk. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this letter, then I'm gone, and the knowledge I meant to pass to my son has died with me. I pray you're family. I pray you're someone who will understand what I tried to do here. During the war, people were terrified. They'd seen what happened in Europe, seen wealth seized and destroyed. They wanted insurance, a safe place to hide what mattered most. I built this vault in 56 and 57 with the help of some good men who knew how to keep secrets. I was paid fair wages for the construction and maintenance, 10% of declared value deposited into accounts for my boy's future. But the real payment was trust. People believed I'd keep their treasures safe, and I did. I logged every item. I maintained the environmental controls. I checked on everything twice a year, like clockwork. Some items were reclaimed, most weren't. The families moved on, or forgot, or passed away without passing down the knowledge. I kept waiting for someone to come looking. No one did. By the late 50s, I realized this might all be sitting here long after I was gone. So I'm writing this letter. If you found the vault, it's yours to manage now. You're the keeper, the custodian. Whatever's unclaimed, whatever has no living heirs with legitimate paperwork, it's yours legally after 60 years of abandonment. Montana law is clear on that. But do it right, do it honest. Return what belongs to others. Keep what's truly unclaimed. And if you're my family, know that I built this for you, for your future, for the hard times I knew would come. May God bless your choices. Thomas Marshall, October 1958. Margaret's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. He knew. He knew it would be found someday, and he wanted it to be yours. Henry's eyes were wet. He built this for us, for this exact moment, and I never knew. I've been living on this land for 57 years, and I never knew he left me this. He left us this, Margaret corrected softly, and now we have to decide what to do with it. They sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by $260 million in preserved history, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on their shoulders. This wasn't just about money. It was about honoring Thomas's trust, about doing right by the families who'd left their treasures here, about being worthy of the secret they'd inherited. We need a lawyer, Henry said finally, someone we trust, someone who can help us do this right. Margaret nodded. Dorothy Chen. She handled your dad's will way back when. She's got to be in her 70s now, but she's still practicing. I see her at the market sometimes. Can we trust her? I think so. She's honest, always has been, and she knows about estate law, probate, all that complicated stuff. Then we call her tomorrow. Henry looked around the vault one last time at the treasures they'd been documenting for 5 days. We show her everything. The documents, the photographs, Thomas's letter, and we ask her to help us figure out who owns what and what happens next. What if she says it all has to go back? What if there's nothing left for us? Henry turned off his flashlight and stood up, his joints protesting. Then at least we'll have done the right thing. At least we'll have finished what my father started. There are worse legacies to leave behind. They climbed the stairs together, sealed the vault, covered their tracks. The walk back to the house felt longer now, weighted with decisions not yet made and futures not yet determined. But something had shifted between them over the past 5 days. They'd stopped being two elderly people waiting to be forgotten. They'd become partners in something larger, custodians of history, keepers of secrets, responsible for choices that would ripple beyond their own lives. That night, Margaret pulled out Dorothy Chen's number from an old address book she'd kept for 40 years. She stared at it for a long time before finally writing it on a piece of paper and leaving it on the kitchen table. In the morning, they would make the call. They would invite someone else into their secret. And whatever happened after that, whatever the law decided or the families claimed or fate determined, they would face it together. Because they'd found more than treasure beneath the oak grove. They'd found purpose. They'd found something worth protecting. And after 6 years of feeling invisible and forgotten, they'd found a reason to stand up and fight for something that mattered. The vault could wait one more night. Dorothy Chen could wait until morning. For now, Margaret and Henry sat at their kitchen table, holding hands across the unpaid bills they'd been drowning in just a week ago and felt something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the fragile kind that breaks at the first sign of trouble, the stubborn kind. The kind that survives winters and silence and children who forget to call. The kind that says, even when you think you're done, even when the world has moved on without you, there might still be one more chapter waiting to be written, and theirs was just beginning. Dorothy Chen answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was steady, professional, the same voice Margaret remembered from decades ago when she'd helped settle Thomas Marshall's estate. Chen and Associates, Dorothy speaking. Dorothy, it's Margaret Marshall, Henry's wife. I don't know if you remember us, but of course I remember you. Dorothy's voice warmed immediately. How are you both? It's been years. Margaret looked across the kitchen table at Henry, who nodded encouragingly. We're fine. Well, not fine exactly. We need your help with something complicated. Legal trouble? No, more like legal confusion. We found something on our property, something that belonged to Henry's father, something valuable. There was a pause. How valuable are we talking? Margaret took a breath. Over $260 million valuable. The silence that followed was so long, Margaret thought the call had dropped. Then Dorothy's voice came back, careful, measured. I think we should meet in person. Are you available this afternoon? 3 hours later, Dorothy Chen pulled up the gravel driveway in a silver sedan that looked newer than anything Margaret and Henry had owned in the last 20 years. She stepped out, looking exactly as Margaret remembered, just older. Her hair was completely silver now, cut short and professional. She wore a wool coat and carried a leather briefcase that had clearly seen decades of use. I brought my recorder and camera, she said, after hugs and pleasantries. Whatever you're about to show me, I want it documented properly from the start. They led her through the house, out the back, across the field toward the oak grove. Dorothy didn't complain about the walk despite wearing heels that sank into the soft earth. She just followed, taking notes, asking questions about the property boundaries and Thomas Marshall's history. At the hatch, she stopped. You're telling me this has been here since 1957? 56, actually, Henry said, kneeling to pull back the covering they'd placed. Took my father nearly 2 years to build it all. They descended together, Dorothy between them, her flashlight adding to theirs. When they reached the steel door and Henry opened it, when the lights flickered on and the chamber revealed itself, Dorothy Chen stopped walking. She just stood there, briefcase in hand, staring. Holy God, she whispered. For the next 4 hours, she examined everything. She photographed the filing cabinets, the crates, the ledger. She read Thomas's letters, the contracts with families, the final note he'd left. She opened random crates to verify contents matched the inventory. She took notes so fast her handwriting became illegible even to her. Finally, she sat down at Thomas's desk and looked at Margaret and Henry standing nervously by the wine collection. This is real, she said, and her voice carried the weight of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just shifted. This is all real. We know, Margaret said. But what does it mean? Legally, who does it belong to? Dorothy opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. That's going to take time to determine, but here's what I know immediately. Montana law regarding abandoned property is clear. If assets are left unclaimed for 60 years or more, and if reasonable effort was made to contact rightful owners, the property reverts to whoever legally controls the land where it was stored. So it's ours? Henry asked. Some of it, probably, but not all. Some of these families might still exist, might have documentation proving ownership. We'll need to research each one, track down descendants, notify anyone with a legitimate claim. She flipped through her notes. This is going to be a massive undertaking. We're talking months of legal work, possibly years. How much will that cost? Margaret's voice was small. Dorothy looked at her kindly. Normally tens of thousands of dollars, but given what you're sitting on, I'd recommend a contingency arrangement. I handle the legal work, research, air tracking, all of it. In exchange, I take 10% of whatever value is determined to be legally yours after all claims are settled. Henry and Margaret looked at each other. That's fair, Henry said, more than fair. But there's something else you need to understand. Dorothy's expression turned serious. The moment this becomes public knowledge, your lives will change. Completely, irreversibly. People will come out of the woodwork. Family members you haven't heard from in years. Strangers claiming connections to the original depositors. Reporters, treasure hunters, the curious, the greedy, the desperate. You need to be prepared for that. Can we keep it secret? Margaret asked. For a little while, maybe, but realistically, no. This kind of discovery, this kind of value, it's going to leak. Someone will notice activity here, or court filings will become public, or someone in my office will talk despite confidentiality agreements. It always gets out. She closed her briefcase. My advice is to control the narrative. We file the proper legal claims, notify the authorities, do everything by the book. That way, when it does go public, you're protected legally. And our children? Margaret's voice cracked. We haven't told them yet. Dorothy studied them both for a long moment. That's your choice, but if you wait too long, they'll hear it from someone else. That could create problems, complications, hurt feelings. Or, Henry said quietly, we could tell them and watch them suddenly care about us again for all the wrong reasons. Dorothy nodded slowly. I understand. Take a few days to think about it, but decide soon. Once we start the legal process, the clock starts ticking. They walked Dorothy back to her car, and she promised to start the preliminary research immediately. She'd file the necessary paperwork with the county, start searching for descendants of the families listed in Thomas's ledger, and prepare a comprehensive legal strategy. One more thing, she said before driving away. Get security cameras installed around this property, today if possible, and consider hiring someone to patrol the area once word gets out. What you've got here, it's not just valuable. It's the kind of thing people do dangerous things to get close to. That night, Henry called a security company in Billings. They came out the next morning and installed cameras around the perimeter, motion sensors near the oak grove, a new alarm system for the house. It cost $2,000 they didn't really have, but Dorothy had advanced them some money against the eventual settlement. For 3 days, life felt almost normal. They went about their routines, tended the vault, helped Dorothy with research from home. No one came around. No one called. It felt like maybe, just maybe, they could keep the secret a little longer. Then the phone rang at 6:15 in the morning on Thursday. It was Sarah. Mum! Her voice was sharp, urgent. Mum, is it true? Margaret's blood went cold. Is what true? The newspaper article. There's an article in the Billings Gazette. They're saying you and Dad found buried treasure on the property, that it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Is it true? Margaret looked at Henry, who'd sat up in bed, instantly awake. How did they find out? So it is true. Oh my God. Mom, why didn't you tell me? We're family. I'm your daughter. Sarah, we only found it a couple weeks ago. We've been trying to figure out what to do, how to handle it legally. You should have called me immediately. I'm an attorney. I could have helped. Instead, I'm finding out from a newspaper article that my own parents are millionaires. We're not millionaires. We don't know what's legally ours yet. Most of it probably belongs to other families. That's not what the article says. It says you have legal claim to everything because it was on your property. Mum, this is huge. This is life-changing. Michael and Daniel need to know. We need to talk about this. As a family. Something in Margaret's chest tightened. Now we're a family? Silence on the other end. Sarah, where were you on my birthday? Where were you when the furnace broke and we were freezing? Where were you for the past 6 years when we needed someone, anyone, to just show up? That's not fair. I've been busy. Work has been insane, and we're always busy with things that matter more than the people who raised us. Margaret's voice shook. But now there's money and suddenly we matter again. Mom, that's not what this is about. Isn't it? Henry took the phone gently from Margaret's hand. Sarah, we'll call you back. Give us some time to process this. Dad, wait. I'm flying out tomorrow. We need to discuss this in person. There are legal implications, inheritance issues, tax considerations. We have a lawyer. You need your family. Sarah's voice dropped, becoming softer. You need us. Henry hung up without responding. Within an hour, both Michael and Daniel had called. Michael was already talking about financial advisors and investment strategies. Daniel just asked if they were okay, if they needed anything. The difference wasn't lost on either Margaret or Henry. By noon, there were reporters at the gate. By evening, someone had posted their address online and treasure hunters were parking along the road, trying to peer onto the property. The security company sent 2 guards to patrol overnight. Dorothy called 6 times with updates. 3 law firms had already contacted her claiming to represent descendants of families from Thomas's ledger. The state tax authority wanted a meeting. The county assessor was demanding a new property evaluation. "It's starting," Dorothy said. "Exactly what I warned you about." That night, Margaret and Henry sat in their living room with all the curtains drawn, listening to car engines and voices outside, and felt their quiet life crumbling around them. "Maybe we should have just left it buried," Margaret whispered. Henry took her hand. "Too late for that now. We opened it. Now we deal with what comes." Sarah arrived Friday afternoon in a rental SUV with her husband, Todd, a man Henry had never particularly liked. Todd was the kind of attorney who talked about billable hours the way normal people talked about the weather. They came through the door with luggage as if planning to stay, and Sarah immediately hugged Margaret with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. "Mom, you look thin. Are you eating? Dad, your color doesn't look good. When's the last time you had a physical?" "We're fine, Sarah." Margaret extracted herself from the hug. "Well, you won't have to worry about medical bills anymore, that's for sure." Sarah sat down on the couch like she owned it. "Todd and I have been discussing your situation. We think you need better legal representation than some small-town estate lawyer. No offense to whoever you hired, but this is major. You need a firm with experience in high-value asset recovery." "Dorothy's doing fine," Henry said. "Dorothy." Todd's voice dripped condescension. "Is that her first name? Does she even have support staff, discovery resources? This kind of case requires a team, not some solo practitioner working out of a strip mall. Her office is downtown, and she's been practicing for 40 years. "Exactly. She's old school. You need modern expertise." Todd pulled out his phone. "I've already reached out to 3 firms in Seattle that specialize in this area. They'd be happy to take over the case." "We're not changing lawyers," Margaret said firmly. Sarah leaned forward. "Mum, I know you're overwhelmed. This is a lot. But you have to think clearly. This money, it's not just about you and Dad. It's family money. Inheritance. Michael and Daniel should be part of these decisions." "Why?" Henry asked. Sarah blinked. "What do you mean, why? We're your children. And when's the last time you acted like it?" The room went silent. Todd looked uncomfortable. Sarah's expression hardened. "That's not fair, Dad. We've had our own lives to manage, our own responsibilities." "So did we. Raising you was a responsibility, one we took seriously. Where was your sense of responsibility when we needed you?" "We're here now." "Because there's money." Sarah stood up, her face flushed. "You're being ridiculous. You're twisting this into something it's not. We care about you. We've always cared. But you're in over your heads here, and you need help. Our help." Before Henry could respond, another car pulled up. "Michael." He came through the door with a briefcase and a man in an expensive suit. "Mum, Dad." Quick hugs, perfunctory. "This is Garrett, my attorney. He specializes in wealth management and estate planning. I've already had him draw up some preliminary documents." "What kind of documents?" Margaret asked. "Trust structures, tax shelters, asset protection strategies. If this fortune is as big as the papers are saying, you need sophisticated planning. The IRS alone will take half if you're not careful." Garrett opened his briefcase. "I've prepared several options for your review. The most advantageous from a tax perspective would be to establish a family trust with you and your children as beneficiaries. That way, when assets are distributed, they're not subject to—" "We haven't decided anything about distribution," Henry interrupted. Michael laughed, but it wasn't friendly. "Dad, come on. Obviously this is family money. It was Grandpa's vault. We're his descendants. Legally we're entitled to a share." "Are you?" Henry stood up, and despite his bad knee, despite his age, he seemed to fill the room. "Legally, this property is ours. The vault is on our land. Your grandfather left no will specifying this treasure should be divided among heirs. So tell me, Michael, on what legal grounds are you entitled to anything?" Michael's smile vanished. "Blood. Family. The fact that I'm your son." Funny how that fact only matters when there's money involved. The doorbell rang before Michael could respond. Daniel had arrived. He came alone. No lawyer, no briefcase. Just Daniel in his teacher's clothes, looking tired and sad. "Hey, Mum. Hey, Dad." His hugs lasted longer than his siblings. He nodded to Sarah and Michael, but didn't seem happy to see them. "Everyone descended at once, huh?" "Seems like it," Margaret said. They all moved to the kitchen table, which suddenly felt too small for the personalities crowding around it. Sarah immediately started talking about legal strategies. Michael jumped in with financial advice. Todd and Garrett compared credentials like they were sizing each other up for a fight. Through it all, Daniel just sat quietly, watching his parents, seeing something the others missed. Finally, Margaret stood up. "Stop, all of you, just stop." The room fell silent. "You want to talk about legal rights? Fine, let's talk about them. You're right that legally some of this fortune might be considered inheritance. Dorothy's researching that, but here's what you need to understand." Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "Your father and I have lived in this house for 43 years. We raised 3 children here. We fed you, clothed you, put you through school. We sacrificed so you could have opportunities we never had." Sarah opened her mouth, but Margaret held up a hand. "When your father lost his job in 2008, we didn't ask you for help. When my mother died and we couldn't afford the funeral we wanted, we didn't ask you for money. When the furnace broke last winter and we were choosing between heat and medication, we didn't call you. Do you know why?" No one answered. "Because you'd already shown us we weren't a priority. Sarah, you sent us brochures for nursing homes. Michael, you forgot my birthday 3 years running. Daniel, you stopped visiting because your wife doesn't like the drive. You all made it very clear that we were no longer important parts of your lives." "Mom," Sarah started. "I'm not finished. You want to talk about family money? About inheritance? Fine. But understand this. That vault sat undiscovered for 67 years. If we hadn't been desperate enough to search the attic, desperate enough to go digging through old papers, it would have sat there another 67 years. We found it. We're dealing with the legal complications. We're managing the stress and the reporters and the treasure hunters and the lawyers circling like sharks. Not you, us." Margaret's hands were shaking, but her voice grew stronger. "So if you're here because you genuinely care, because you want to help us navigate this out of love and concern, then stay. Please, we could use the support. But if you're here because you see dollar signs, because you're calculating your share before we've even figured out what's ours, then leave. Because we've lived without you for 6 years. We can live without you through this too." The silence that followed was devastating. Sarah's face was red, her jaw tight. "I can't believe you'd say that to us. After everything we've done." "What have you done?" Henry asked quietly. "Specifically, what have you done for us in the past 5 years?" Sarah couldn't answer. Neither could Michael. They looked at each other, then at their parents, and something crumbled in their expressions. Not shame exactly. More like the realization that they'd been caught, exposed, revealed as exactly what they were. Daniel, however, had tears running down his face. "You're right," he said, "about all of it. I abandoned you. I let life get in the way, let excuses pile up until they became walls. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Margaret's anger softened slightly. "Daniel, no, you should be angry. You should be furious. I was the closest, and I stayed away the longest. I have no excuse. I was a coward." He wiped his eyes. "I'm not here for money. I'm here because I love you, and I've been a terrible son, and I want to do better. Even if you tell me to leave right now, I want you to know that." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "We know, sweetheart." Sarah stood up abruptly. "I don't have to sit here and be attacked. Todd, we're leaving." "Sarah, sit down," Henry said. "No, you've made yourself very clear. You think we're mercenary, that we only care about money. Fine, think whatever you want, but don't expect me to sit here and be insulted in front of your brother, your parents, the family you claim to care about." Henry's voice was steel. "If you walk out that door right now, you prove every word your mother said." Sarah stopped, hand on her purse. For a long moment she stood frozen, deciding. Then slowly she sat back down. "I'm listening." Michael hadn't moved. He was staring at the table, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, like armor that hadn't protected him from anything important. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. "I didn't realize we'd gotten so far apart." "Distance isn't measured in miles," Margaret said. "It's measured in moments, in phone calls not made, in birthdays forgotten, in choices about what matters most." They sat together in uncomfortable silence, the kind that comes when truth has been spoken and can't be taken back. Outside, they could hear voices, people walking past the house, probably reporters or curiosity seekers hoping for a glimpse of the millionaire farmers. "Dorothy says some of the items will need to be returned to rightful heirs," Henry said finally. "Families with documentation, legal claims. We're not trying to keep things that aren't ours, but whatever's legitimately unclaimed, whatever we're legally entitled to after all the claims are settled, that's ours to decide what to do with." "And what are you thinking?" Michael asked. "We don't know yet. We have to wait and see what's left after the legal process. But I'll tell you what we're not doing. We're not just dividing it up and spending it. Your grandfather built that vault for a reason. He was trusted with something precious. We're not going to dishonor that trust by being greedy." Sarah took a breath. "What do you need from us, really?" "Time," Margaret said. "Patience. The benefit of the doubt that we're going to handle this responsibly. And if you can manage it, some of the care and attention you would have given us if we were broke and dying instead of broke and suddenly wealthy." That hit home. Sarah flinched. Michael looked away. Daniel just nodded. "I can do that," Daniel said. "I'll try," Sarah said quietly. Michael said nothing for a moment. Then, "I need to think about a lot of things. But I won't fight you on this. It's your property, your discovery. You're right about that." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was honest, and for Margaret and Henry, that was enough for now. Over the next week, the chaos intensified. Dorothy filed formal notices with every family listed in Thomas's ledger. 3 responded with documentation proving ownership. Those items were prepared for return. 7 more families couldn't be found despite extensive searching. 4 had died out completely, no living descendants. The rest were still under investigation. Meanwhile, the media attention exploded. National news picked up the story. Elderly couple discovers fortune buried by WW2-era custodian. Reporters camped outside the gate. Helicopters flew overhead trying to get footage of the property. The town of Whitefish, 40 miles away, suddenly saw an influx of tourists hoping to drive past the Marshall farm. Some people were supportive. Old neighbors brought casseroles and offers of help. Strangers sent letters of encouragement, but others were cruel. Anonymous notes accusing them of lying, of stealing, of being greedy. Death threats from people who thought they deserved the treasure more. Treasure hunters who tried to sneak onto the property at night looking for other hidden vaults. Through it all, Sarah and Michael kept their distance. They called occasionally awkward conversations that never lasted long. But Daniel came every weekend. He helped install better fencing, sat with them through interviews with lawyers and tax accountants, just offered his presence. "I'm not trying to make up for 6 years in 6 weeks," he told Margaret one evening. "I just don't want to lose 6 more." Then, on a Tuesday morning, Margaret collapsed. Henry found her on the kitchen floor, conscious but disoriented, her left arm numb. He called 911 with shaking hands, and the ambulance arrived within 15 minutes. At the hospital, doctors ran tests while Henry sat in the waiting room, his bad knee bouncing with anxiety. Stress-induced, the doctor said later. Her blood pressure had spiked dangerously high. She needed rest, peace, the opposite of everything the past few weeks had been. Henry called the kids from the hospital. Daniel arrived within an hour. Sarah said she'd try to get there tomorrow. Michael said he was in meetings but would come when he could. Daniel stayed through the night, sleeping in a chair next to Henry in the waiting room. When visiting hours resumed in the morning, they went in together to find Margaret awake, hooked to monitors, looking small and fragile in the hospital bed. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice was weak. "Just overdid it, I guess. The doctor says you need to reduce stress." Henry took her hand carefully, mindful of the IV. "We're going to figure out how to do that." "How? We can't exactly undiscover the vault." "No, but we can control how we respond to it. We can set boundaries, limit who has access to us, stop trying to manage everything ourselves." Margaret smiled weakly. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just stopped listening 60 years ago." Daniel laughed through his tears. "I'm glad you're okay, Mum. You scared us." "Scared myself." She looked at both of them. "Your sister coming?" She said tomorrow. "And Michael?" Daniel hesitated. "He's got meetings." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Understanding, acceptance, grief. "Of course he does." Sarah did arrive the next day, stayed for 3 hours, spent most of that time on her phone. Michael never came. Sent flowers instead with a card that said, "Thinking of you." But Daniel stayed. Slept in the chair, brought Henry coffee, sat with Margaret when she couldn't sleep, read to her from old books she loved. And in that hospital room, with machines beeping and fluorescent lights humming and the smell of antiseptic everywhere, Margaret and Henry Marshall made their decision. "We're not doing this for money," Margaret said. "Whatever we get from the vault, whatever's legally ours, we're going to use it for good, for other people, for the things that actually matter." "I know," Henry said. "We'll keep enough to be comfortable, to not worry about furnaces or medication. But the rest, it goes to something better, something your father would be proud of." "What about the kids?" Margaret looked at Daniel, asleep in the chair, his jacket draped over him like a blanket. "Daniel gets a share. He's earned it. Not because of blood, but because he came back, because he's here." "And the others?" "They're children. We'll set up trusts for the grandchildren. They shouldn't suffer because their parents forgot us. But Sarah and Michael," she shook her head. "They made their choice. Now we make ours." Henry kissed her forehead. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything. This money, it's revealed everyone's true nature, including ours, and I want to make sure ours is worthy of what we've been given." When Dorothy visited the next day, they told her their plan. She listened carefully, took notes, and nodded. "I'll start drawing up the documents. But you should know your other children could challenge this, could claim undue influence or diminished capacity." "Let them try," Henry said. "We're of sound mind, we're making informed decisions, and we have the right to distribute our assets however we see fit." "That you do," Dorothy agreed. "That you do." Margaret was released from the hospital 3 days later with strict instructions to rest, avoid stress, and monitor her blood pressure. Easier said than done when the world wanted a piece of them. But they started setting boundaries. Dorothy handled all media requests. The security company increased patrols. They disconnected the landline and gave their cell numbers to only a handful of people. Slowly, life became manageable again. And as December approached, as the first snow fell on the Montana hills and the oak grove stood bare and silent under grey skies, Margaret and Henry Marshall sat in their warm house, furnace finely fixed, medication fully stocked, and felt something they hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because they had money, but because they knew who they were, what they valued, what they were willing to fight for. The vault had revealed more than treasure. It had revealed truth. And sometimes truth is the most valuable thing you can find. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks recovering at home, and for the first time in 6 years, their house felt like something other than a place to wait for the end. Daniel visited every other day, sometimes with his kids, sometimes alone. He'd bring groceries, help Henry with repairs, sit with Margaret while she rested. They talked about things they hadn't discussed in years, memories from when he was young, mistakes they'd all made, regrets they carried. "I let Jessica convince me you were fine without us," Daniel said one afternoon while helping Margaret fold laundry. "She'd say you were independent, that you'd call if you needed anything, and I wanted to believe it because it was easier than admitting I was being a bad son." "We all tell ourselves stories to make our choices easier," Margaret said. "The question is what we do when we finally see the truth." "I'm here now. I know it doesn't erase 6 years, but I'm here. That's all we ever wanted, sweetheart. Just to matter to someone." Sarah called twice during those weeks, brief conversations where she asked about Margaret's health, but never mentioned the vault or the money or the uncomfortable truths they'd spoken in that kitchen. Michael didn't call at all. Sent a fruit basket with a card his assistant had probably signed. By mid-December, Dorothy had completed most of her research. She arrived at the house on a cold Tuesday morning with a briefcase full of documents and news that would change everything. "I've tracked down representatives for 11 of the 34 families listed in your father-in-law's ledger," she began, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "They have legitimate documentation, and I've arranged for their items to be returned. That accounts for roughly $48 million in value." Henry whistled low. "That's a lot to give back. It's also the right thing to do. These families have legal claims. But here's the important part. The remaining 23 families either died out completely with no legal heirs or cannot be located despite exhaustive searching. Under Montana's abandoned property statutes, and given that Thomas Marshall maintained detailed records proving he made reasonable efforts to contact owners, the remaining assets legally belong to you." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "How much are we talking about?" Dorothy pulled out a summary sheet. "After returns, after legal fees, after taxes, you're looking at approximately $212 million, conservatively. Some items could appraise higher." The number hung in the air like something physical, something too heavy to hold. "That's not possible," Henry said. "People like us don't just stumble into $200 million. "Apparently you do when your father builds a preservation vault and keeps it secret for 67 years. Dorothy smiled gently. "The money is real. The claim is legal. What you do with it is entirely up to you." Margaret and Henry looked at each other across the table, having the silent conversation of people who'd been married 52 years. They'd talked about this already, planned it during Margaret's hospital stay, but hearing the actual number made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "We've made some decisions," Margaret said finally, "and we'd like your help implementing them." Dorothy pulled out a fresh legal pad. "I'm listening. First, we keep $5 million. That's more than enough for us. New furnace, medical care, maybe a trip somewhere warm. Comfort, but not extravagance. We're too old to change who we are." Dorothy nodded, writing. "Second, $40 million goes to establishing a foundation, the Thomas Marshall Foundation for Elderly Care. It'll provide financial assistance to seniors who've been abandoned by family. Help with medical bills, housing, basic dignity. We want it managed by professionals, but we want oversight to make sure it actually helps people. I can recommend several non-profit administrators," Dorothy said, "people with excellent reputations. Third, $20 million to the town. Infrastructure, hospital equipment, school programs, things that benefit everyone, not just us. That'll make you very popular around here." "We don't care about popular," Henry said. We care about useful. Margaret continued. 15 million to establish a historical museum. The vault itself will be converted into a public space, showcasing the items we're keeping for preservation. Educational programs, tours, a place people can learn about history and why it matters. Beautiful idea, Dorothy said, still writing. Daniel receives 10 million outright. He's earned it. He came back. He showed up. That matters more than blood. Dorothy looked up. And your other children? Margaret's expression hardened slightly. 5 million in trust for each of their children, our grandchildren, to be accessed when they turn 25. Sarah and Michael get nothing directly. They could challenge that, claim undue influence, especially given your recent health issues. Let them try. We're of sound mind. You'll document that. We'll have doctors confirm it if necessary. This is our choice, made freely, and we're prepared to defend it. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. You understand this will likely end your relationships with Sarah and Michael permanently. Our relationships with them ended 6 years ago, Henry said. We're just making it official. And the remaining funds? Split between the foundation, the museum, and community grants. We want it used, not hoarded. We want it to do good while we're alive to see it. Dorothy closed her notebook. I'll draft everything this week. We'll need signatures, witnesses, notarization. And I'd recommend filming video statements explaining your reasoning, just in case there are challenges later. When do we announce it? Margaret asked. I'd suggest a press conference. Control the narrative, invite media, make a formal statement, take questions. Show people you're competent, thoughtful, and committed to using this wealth responsibly. Henry and Margaret looked at each other again. Neither of them had ever been comfortable in front of cameras, had never wanted attention or accolades. But this wasn't about them anymore. It was about honoring Thomas Marshall's legacy, about showing their community that good fortune could be used for good purpose. Set it up, Margaret said. We'll do it. The press conference was scheduled for January 7th at the community center in Whitefish. Dorothy handled the logistics, sent invitations to local and national media, prepared talking points and documents. In the week leading up to it, Margaret and Henry barely slept. They practiced their statement, revised it, practiced again. They wanted to get it right. Daniel came over to help them choose what to wear. Nothing too fancy, he advised. You want to look like yourselves, just more polished. We clean up okay for a couple of old farmers, Henry said, adjusting his bolo tie in the mirror. You look distinguished, Dad. Both of you do. The morning of the conference, Margaret threw up twice from nerves. Henry's hands shook so badly he could barely button his shirt. But they got dressed, climbed into Daniel's car, and drove to Whitefish, with Dorothy following behind in her sedan. The community center parking lot was packed. News vans with satellite dishes, reporters with cameras and microphones, curious townspeople who'd heard something big was happening. Inside, Dorothy had arranged for a small stage with a podium, chairs for Margaret and Henry, and enough room for cameras and press. They waited in a back room while people filed in. Through the door, they could hear the crowd growing, voices overlapping, speculation building. Margaret gripped Henry's hand so tight her knuckles went white. We don't have to do this, he said. We could just release a statement through Dorothy. No, people deserve to hear it from us, in our own words. At exactly 10 a.m., Dorothy opened the door. They're ready for you. Walking onto that stage felt like walking into a spotlight that could burn them alive. Cameras flashed, people stared. The room fell silent as they took their seats behind the podium. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Dorothy stepped to the microphone first. Good morning. I'm Dorothy Chen, legal counsel for Henry and Margaret Marshall. My clients have asked me to facilitate this press conference as they make an important announcement regarding the discovery on their property. They'll read a prepared statement, then take limited questions. Please be respectful. She stepped aside. Henry and Margaret stood together behind the podium, and Margaret pulled out the paper they'd written and rewritten a dozen times. Her voice shook as she began. "Good morning. My name is Margaret Marshall. This is my husband, Henry. We've lived on our property outside of town for 43 years. We're not wealthy people. We're not important people. Until recently, we were just two old folks that most people had forgotten about, including our own children." She paused, swallowed hard. 3 weeks ago, we discovered a preservation vault on our land. It was built by Henry's father, Thomas Marshall, between 1956 and 1958. Inside, we found items that families had entrusted to Thomas during uncertain times. World War II, the Cold War, periods when people feared losing everything. Thomas was paid to preserve and protect these treasures. He did his job well, too well. He died before passing on the knowledge, and the vault sat sealed for 67 years. Henry took over, his voice steadier than Margaret's. "When we found it, we had to decide what to do. We could have kept quiet, sold things off slowly, gotten rich without anyone knowing. But that's not who we are. That's not what Thomas would have wanted. So we did it the right way. We hired a lawyer. We researched the families. We're returning items to anyone with legitimate legal claims. That accounts for roughly $48 million in value." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret continued. "The remaining assets, approximately $212 million, legally belong to us under Montana abandoned property law. We didn't steal it. We didn't do anything wrong. It's ours. But here's what we're going to do with it." She looked directly at the cameras. "We're keeping $5 million for ourselves. That will ensure we're comfortable for the rest of our lives. We can fix our house, pay for medical care, maybe take a vacation. But we don't need more than that. We've lived on less for decades. Money doesn't change who we are." $40 million will establish the Thomas Marshall Foundation for Elderly Care, Henry said. It'll provide financial assistance to seniors who've been abandoned by family, people who are choosing between heat and medication, people who feel invisible, people like us before we found the vault. If you're elderly and struggling and no one seems to care, this foundation will care. $20 million goes to our community, Margaret added. Infrastructure improvements, hospital equipment, school programs, public services. This town has been our home for decades. We want to give back. $15 million will create a historical museum and education center. The vault itself will be converted into a public space showcasing preserved items and teaching people about the importance of protecting history. Our son Daniel will receive $10 million. He came back when we needed him. He showed up. He remembered we exist. Family isn't just blood, it's presence, it's care. He earned this through love, not obligation. The room had gone completely silent now. Every eye was fixed on them. Our other two children, Sarah and Michael, will receive nothing directly. Margaret's voice didn't waver. They abandoned us. They stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped caring. But the moment they heard about money, they suddenly remembered they had parents. We won't reward that. However, we will establish trusts for our grandchildren, $5 million each, accessible when they turn 25. The children shouldn't suffer for their parents' choices. The remaining funds will be divided between the foundation, the museum, and community grants, Henry finished. We want this money to do good. We want Thomas's legacy to be about generosity, not greed, about dignity, not wealth, about remembering that every person matters, regardless of their age or bank account. Margaret folded the paper carefully. We know some people will disagree with our choices. Some will call us foolish for giving away so much. Our own children might hate us for this decision, but we've been poor and forgotten. We've been invisible. And we refuse to use this fortune to become the kind of people who made us feel that way. Thank you. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then someone in the back started clapping. Someone else joined in. Within moments, the entire room was on its feet, applauding. Some people were crying. Others were smiling. Reporters were scribbling notes frantically. Cameras flashed like lightning. Dorothy stepped forward to take questions, but Margaret and Henry just stood there, holding hands, overwhelmed by the response. They'd expected skepticism, criticism, judgment. Instead, they got something they hadn't felt in years: respect. The questions lasted 30 minutes. Reporters asked about legal processes, timeline for the foundation launch, museum plans, their relationship with their children. Margaret and Henry answered honestly, simply with the same straightforward dignity they'd brought to the statement. When it was over, when they finally left the stage, people approached them. Strangers who shook their hands and thanked them. Elderly couples who cried and said the foundation would change lives. Young people who said they'd been inspired by the choice to give rather than hoard. One old man, probably 80, with a veteran's cap and tears streaming down his weathered face, gripped Henry's hand and whispered, "My kids don't call either, but you made me feel like I still matter. Thank you." That moment, more than the applause or the cameras or the praise, that moment made everything worth it. The story exploded nationally. Headlines read, "Elderly couple chooses compassion over wealth," and "Millionaire farmers give fortune to those who need it most," and "The vault that revealed what really matters." Talk shows wanted interviews, celebrities tweeted about them, a filmmaker wanted to make a documentary. But Margaret and Henry mostly stayed home, working with Dorothy and non-profit administrators to build the infrastructure for their plans. They hired architects to convert the vault into a museum space. They interviewed candidates to run the foundation. They met with town officials about infrastructure improvements. Sarah called once, 3 days after the press conference. Her voice was ice. "I hope you're happy. You've humiliated us publicly, made us look like horrible children to the entire world." "We didn't make you look like anything," Margaret said quietly. "We just told the truth about our relationship. If that humiliates you, maybe you should think about why. You're cutting us out of the will, our inheritance, money that should be ours. Sarah, you stopped being our daughter years before we found that vault. This isn't about punishment. It's about honesty. We're giving our money to people and causes that actually care about us. You're not one of them. You'll regret this. The only thing we regret is how long it took us to see who you really are." Sarah hung up without another word. She didn't call again. Michael sent a lawyer's letter threatening to contest the distribution. Dorothy responded with documentation of their competency, video statements, medical evaluations proving sound mind. The threat went nowhere. Michael's lawyer advised him he had no legal standing to challenge their decisions about their own assets. But Daniel thrived. He cried when they told him about the 10 million, said it was too much, that he didn't deserve it. "You came back," Margaret told him. "When we needed someone, when we were invisible and forgotten, you came back. This isn't payment. It's recognition that love showed up when greed didn't." Daniel used part of his inheritance to quit teaching and work full-time helping establish the foundation and museum. His kids, Katie and Emma, ages 8 and 11, became regular visitors. They'd run through the farmhouse, help Margaret in the garden, listen to Henry's stories about their great-grandfather Thomas. Slowly, the house filled with laughter again, with life. By March, the foundation was operational. They'd hired a director, a woman named Patricia, who'd spent 30 years in non-profit elder care. The first grants went out to seniors across Montana, money for medical bills, housing repairs, heating assistance, basic dignity. The letters that came back broke Margaret's heart and healed it at the same time. One woman wrote, "I haven't been able to afford my arthritis medication in 2 years. I was surviving on ibuprofen and prayer. Your foundation paid for 6 months of treatment. I can button my shirts again. I can open jars. I can hug my grandchildren without crying from pain. You've given me my hands back. Thank you. Another. My children moved to different states and stopped calling. I was eating one meal a day to afford my rent. Your foundation paid 3 months of expenses and connected me with community resources I didn't know existed. For the first time in 5 years, I don't feel invisible. Someone sees me. Someone cares. Thank you for reminding me that I still matter. The letters kept coming, hundreds of them, each one a life changed, a person remembered, a dignity restored. The town infrastructure projects began in April. New ambulance for the fire department, updated equipment for the hospital, technology grants for schools, playground restoration at the elementary school where Daniel used to teach, a new heating system for the senior center. Nothing flashy, nothing with their names on it, just quiet improvements that made life better for everyone. The museum opened in June, a year after they'd first discovered the vault. Architects had transformed the underground chamber into a beautiful space, climate-controlled display areas, educational exhibits, interactive stations where visitors could learn about World War II-era preservation efforts, about the families who'd entrusted their treasures to Thomas Marshall, about the importance of protecting history. The entrance was marked by a simple bronze plaque, the Thomas Marshall Preservation Vault, built 1956 through 58, sealed and protected until discovered by his son and daughter-in-law Henry and Margaret Marshall, December 2024. Dedicated to the principle that what we save reveals what we value. Opening day brought over 300 visitors, school groups, history enthusiasts, families, elderly couples who remembered Thomas Marshall and wanted to see what he'd built. Margaret and Henry cut the ribbon together, then stepped back and let others take center stage. This wasn't about them. It was about something bigger. One afternoon in July, Margaret and Henry returned to the vault alone for the first time since it had been converted. They walked through the museum, past the displays and exhibits, to a small private room at the back that had been preserved exactly as Thomas had left it. His desk, his ledger, his careful handwriting documenting decades of trust and responsibility. Margaret ran her fingers across the desktop, the same way she had that first day when the discovery was new and overwhelming. "You did good, Thomas," Henry said to his father's memory. "You built something that lasted, something that mattered." They sat in the quiet for a while, not talking, just being. Then Margaret said, "Do you ever regret it, giving away so much?" Henry thought about it. Not once. Not even for a second. Even though we could have been truly wealthy, traveled the world, bought anything we wanted. We are wealthy, Margaret. We have a warm house. We have our health mostly. We have Daniel back. We have grandchildren who visit. We have a community that respects us. We have purpose. He took her hand. We're richer now than we would have been with $200 million in the bank. She leaned her head on his shoulder. 52 years. That's how long we've been married. Best investment I ever made, even when I'm stubborn, especially then. They sat together in Thomas Marshall's preserved room, two elderly people who'd stumbled into fortune and chosen compassion and felt the kind of peace that money can't buy. By fall, the Thomas Marshall Foundation had helped over 400 elderly individuals across Montana and neighboring states. Stories appeared regularly in local papers. Seniors getting medical care, keeping their homes, eating proper meals, feeling seen and valued. Patricia, the director, said requests for assistance were coming in faster than they could process them. The need was vast, but at least now there was help. Margaret started speaking at events, sharing their story, advocating for elder care reform. She was terrified at first, her voice shaking through every speech, but she got better, stronger. People listened. Policymakers started paying attention. The conversation around how society treats its elderly began to shift, slowly but undeniably. Henry spent his time consulting on the museum, helping with historical accuracy, sharing stories about his father that brought Thomas to life for visitors. He gave tours to school groups, His bad knee finally replaced thanks to the money they'd kept for themselves. His medication fully covered. His voice strong as he talked about preservation and legacy and the importance of finishing what others start. Daniel's family became a fixture at the farm. Every Sunday they'd have dinner together. Katie and Emma would help Margaret cook or follow Henry to his workshop where he taught them basic carpentry or run through the fields the way Daniel had as a boy. The house that had been silent for 6 years was full again, not with the children who'd left, but with the family who'd stayed. In October, they received a letter from Sarah. No return address, postmarked from Seattle. Inside was a single page. Mum and Dad, I've been in therapy, trying to understand how things got so broken between us. My therapist says I need to take accountability for my choices, so here it is. I was a terrible daughter. I prioritized work, status, convenience over the people who raised me. I justified it by saying you were independent, that you'd ask if you needed help. But the truth is, I was relieved not to deal with aging parents. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I see what I did. I see what I lost. I don't expect anything from you. Not money, not reconciliation, not absolution. Just wanted you to know that you were right about everything you said. Love, Sarah. Margaret read it twice, then showed it to Henry. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd confronted their children months ago, and felt something complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. Sarah had seen the truth. That was something. Should we respond? Margaret asked. Not yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. Michael never wrote, never called. They heard through Daniel that he'd told people the Marshall estate had been mishandled, that his parents weren't competent, that family money had been stolen. But the stories didn't gain traction. Too many people had seen Margaret and Henry's press conference, heard their clarity, witnessed their purpose. Michael's complaints sounded like what they were, the bitter resentment of someone who'd lost something they never actually had. As December approached and the 1-year anniversary of finding the vault neared, Margaret and Henry were invited to accept an award from the Montana Nonprofit Association. They almost declined, uncomfortable with recognition, but Dorothy convinced them to go. You're not just a feel-good story, she said. You're changing how people think about wealth, about family, about responsibility to community. Let them honor that. The ceremony was small, elegant. 200 people in a hotel ballroom in Helena. The governor spoke. So did Patricia from the foundation. They showed a video compilation of people the foundation had helped, faces and voices testifying to lives changed, dignity restored, hope rekindled. When Margaret and Henry walked to the stage to accept the award, a bronze sculpture of hands reaching upward, the room rose in a standing ovation that lasted 3 full minutes. Margaret cried. Henry gripped her hand tight enough to hurt. They stood together, 2 ordinary people who'd made extraordinary choices, and felt the weight of gratitude from strangers who'd never be strangers again. Margaret's acceptance speech was short. We didn't do anything special. We just remembered what it felt like to be forgotten, and we decided no one else should feel that way if we could prevent it. Thomas Marshall built something meant to preserve treasures. We just expanded the definition of treasure to include people. Thank you for recognizing that some fortunes are meant to be shared. The applause followed them off stage, into the reception, all the way home to their farmhouse, where they sat on their porch swing that night, wrapped in blankets against the December cold, watching stars emerge in the clear Montana sky. Next month we'll have been married 53 years, Henry said. You keeping count? Always have been. Margaret leaned into him. Do you think Thomas knew? When he built that vault, do you think he somehow knew it would lead to all this? I think he knew that what you preserve reveals what you value. He valued trust, responsibility, protection. We're just carrying that forward in a different way. I love you, Henry Marshall. I've loved you since I was 19 years old, and I'll love you until my last breath. I know. That's the only treasure I ever really needed. They sat together as the temperature dropped and the stars wheeled overhead. Two people who'd found fortune and chosen purpose, who'd been abandoned and chose forgiveness, who'd been broken and chose building. Their story had started with desperation and a crumbling house and children who forgot to call. It had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined: legacy, impact, meaning that would outlast them both. Inside the house, the phone rang. Daniel, probably, calling to check on them the way he did every night now. The bills on the kitchen table were all paid. The furnace hummed warmly. The lights worked. The cabinets held food. All the practical problems that had weighed them down for years were solved. But the real treasure, the thing that actually mattered, had nothing to do with the vault or the money or the museum or the foundation. It was this: the feeling of still mattering, of still having purpose, of being seen and valued and needed, not for what they owned, but for who they chose to be when fortune finally found them. Anyone can inherit wealth. The real question is what you build with it. Do you hoard it, spending your fortune on yourself until the money runs out and all you're left with is loneliness? Or do you invest it in others, planting seeds of compassion that grow long after you're gone? Margaret and Henry Marshall had answered that question in the only way they knew how: with dignity, with generosity, with the kind of stubborn grace that comes from surviving hardship and refusing to let it make you hard. As the first snow of December began to fall, dusting the 80 acres that had hidden secrets for 67 years, Margaret and Henry sat together on their porch swing, holding hands the way they had for half a century. The vault beneath the oak grove was now a beacon of history and hope. The farmhouse that had been silent was now filled with grandchildren's laughter every weekend. The community that had forgotten them now carried their legacy forward in hospitals and schools and senior centers across the state. They hadn't just discovered buried treasure, they'd unearthed something far more valuable: the chance to be remembered not for what they found, but for what they chose to do when fortune finally chose them. Because at the end of every story, at the close of every life, the only question that matters is this: did you leave the world better than you found it? Did you choose love over bitterness? Did you remember that every person carries value beyond their bank account? Margaret and Henry Marshall, two forgotten farmers on the edge of nowhere, had answered that question with a resounding yes. And in doing so, they'd proven that the greatest treasures aren't buried in vaults. They're built in moments of choice, in acts of compassion, in the stubborn insistence that every life matters, every elder deserves dignity, and every fortune is nothing more than an opportunity to prove what you truly value. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering what matters most. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truest measure of wealth isn't what you have, but what you give away.